Hi, everyone. Welcome back to once again another of our podcast episode. And on this episode, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper um, investigation into what we started in the previous series, where we actually delve into cultural myths and the narratives that shape all of us because we are born within cultures. And as long as we are born within cultures, our independent agency is often shaped and molded by the stories that are going on just beneath the surface of the cultures that we find ourselves in. So oftentimes these cultural myths and narratives are not very straightforward, as we have pointed out when we talk about things like how we view leadership or how we view the supernatural, religion, the superstitious, right? So we talk about how these things are actually symbols of something much deeper beneath the surface. And I thought we would just like take some of these themes that we have been speaking about, for example, culture and superstition, or culture and um, relationships, culture and the understanding of love, and um, and culture and the understanding of education, and just to to tear apart and deconstruct, right? Which is something that we started on the last season, but I wanted to kind of answer this question. If we do not actually go along with what culture says about um, some of these threats, then how do we then begin to reorder our own narratives and reorder our own beliefs and values if culture itself does not provide us sufficient or enough autonomy to decide for ourselves what we deem to be good or moral or healthy, then how do we even begin to think about this thing? Do we have other alternatives to actually think about um, such questions? So today we're going to start right at the beginning, right? So I mean, I come from the Christian tradition, and so it is quite imperative that I need to start with the book of Genesis. So in the book of Genesis, the first line reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." I can, at this point, go on and give you a treatise, and there are many videos out there that will give you a treatise or an argument on how the earth was created in six actual human days, right? And argue for that, and or argue for the fact that human evolution doesn't exist, and um, human beings are created as a special being and order that is somehow above animals, and go down that line, right? To say how humans are kind of so separated from the rest of the natural order. But that's not where I want to bring us to today, because as you have known from my previous podcast and talks, that um, I'm kind of like leaning away from what some would call traditional Christianity, and actually provide some insight into the fact that oftentimes some of these things that we actually cling on to as absolutes are merely symbols. And symbols don't mean that they are not powerful or they are not effectual, right? But symbols mean they point to even a deeper reality, deeper than what we commonly would be true or historically accurate, but they are nonetheless sometimes even more true than historical facts because they speak to each and every one of our souls. I mean, the whole idea of God, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So the whole idea of God being um, universal, something that all of us would find our, in some sense, identity and origin from. That itself is already kind of like a meta narrative, something that goes beyond just whether this is simply true, but it goes into the kind of like the depths of our being, our souls, where whether we feel that we are more than just sucking air, um, sweating, or feeling the pangs of hunger and being able to chew, being able to move our limbs, whether we are more than that, whether we are actually beings who feel acutely a sense of purpose or even purposelessness, right? Um, and that is why we often seek to find deeper meaning in our work, in our relationships. We often ask why. So why are these things happening? Or how did these things came to come to be, right? Or how did, for example, a situation or a conflict or tension arise between two persons? How did someone become so distraught through abuse? How did trauma develop, right? And right now, we're even thinking about how is it that the mind begins to grow and think, right? At which stage does the mind begin to process certain information in certain ways? So, I mean, all this about, in some sense, all these are about beginnings, right? How did things begin? And yet, we're not just talking about historical beginnings. For example, um, did all of our minds started thinking in a certain year? We're not thinking about did all of our minds share the same fatherly kind of figure? Did we come from the same family? We're not talking about that, right? We are going much deeper into recognizing that though we are different minds and though we have different fathers, mothers, families of origin, but we share some fundamental human soul, deep impulse traits that are uniform in some sense across culture, persons, right? We all share the desire to be loved, and that's what we covered when we went through the idea of what is love, right? So we said love can be actually defined in many ways in your context, in whether you believe in monogamy or even, I mean, non-monogamy or wherever you are on the spectrum, whether you are single or not. But the whole idea is that we stick to go through this process of piecing together memories of people that have connected with us over a long time. And we seek to show some kind of concern towards them. And we seek to also kind of hope that they show concern back to us and that they would reciprocate this connection. So this is a very natural thing. And it doesn't, and knowing this doesn't mean it removes kind of like the mysteries of life. Like, oh, so you finally find out what love is. So you must be able to navigate it wonderfully and wondrously and avoid the pitfalls. No, nothing like that. It seems like the more that we understand this kind of universal processes that are so deep in us that when we are in a community, we try to draw from them a sense of identity. It is so natural, it happens, it is part of who we are as human beings. The more then we wonder, right, how do we learn to healthily find detachment from that so that we can actually function as personal, as individual thinking beings, thinking agents, even as we try to form communities and social bonds, but how do we remain we or me or you in the midst of wanting to find that kind of community, right? How do we still keep our uniqueness? I mean, all those questions exist because we are talking about beginnings, right? So when we talk about God, oftentimes we think about God being strong, right? Like this ancient, I don't know, worship place, right? Strong kind of a religious structure that we see here, right? So oftentimes when we think about God, we think of this image of something appearing out of nothing, or a certain heavenly force with like Zeus, right, with divine arms putting things together. And yet, oftentimes, when we look into the ancient tradition of the scriptures in Genesis, when it says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and began to kind of unfold to us the different ways he orders the world and structures the world to kind of categorize the different type of species and beings and he would step back like an artist and say it is good. Do we mean the same thing? Which means in our mind when we think about God, at the beginning, we think of him um, creating things, and the whole process, scientific process of creation comes into our mind, right? Like how he actually probably made the giraffe, or how he made the ant, right? He put some composition of certain elements and materials and all that. And all that gets into the debate, right? Whether God is the ultimate source of evolution and those kind of arena of questions. But whether you believe God is the originator of evolution or not, or even whether you are totally convinced that there is a supreme creator, or whether you are sitting on the fence, I don't think that's the point of Genesis. So I've been listening to podcasts, and I've been thinking deeply about the kind of faith that we inherited from the from the Jewish religion, right? Christianity is not a new religion. It was um, an offshoot of the Jewish religion. So if you think about Genesis, we must read it within its literary context. So its literary context there, it's a moral myth. Again, it is a kind of social cultural narrative that is presented to us. But in this cultural narrative, there is something so beautiful about it, right? Because it actually talks about the beginnings of all things as the beginnings of order and beauty amidst chaos and emptiness. So in the beginning, there was emptiness. There's a sense that there isn't meaning, there isn't a sense of purpose, right? And talking about what we talked about just now, about children going through trauma, being shaped, and we are trying to find out, what causes this, or even we ourselves, as we go through different seasons in life, we evolve and we find that certain connections no longer align with us, right? So, and we struggle to think what happened to us. So, actually, when we look at the scriptural tradition is trying to inform that aspect of what shapes us. It's trying to get us thinking about exactly the conversation that we ourselves naturally life would cause us to gravitate towards, to draw, to be curious about, which is what is a human being? What shapes us? What is at our beginnings, right? So, what is at the beginnings of our relationships? What's at the beginnings of our education, of our mind? How do we begin to think about thinking? I think that's the point of the book of Genesis. How did order and beauty, um, what does it look like? What does it look like to order life in a way that is structured and not just, um, you know, purposeless? I mean, most of us have been in companies or are in companies that seem to be going towards a downward spiral where they don't really have purpose to the roles and to the duties that or the processes. So everything seems to be overlapping, right? So Genesis is a rebuke to that. It's saying that there ought to be some kind of roles if we want to have productivity, right? So that's the idea. So I used to grow up loving absolutes, right? So I was the one that was arguing for the 7 day, um, 7 real human days in terms of creation and how that is literal and all that, right? But I realized that yeah, I love to also rally towards a grand cause. For example, like, there's absolute good and absolute evil, and there's this personality called Satan, and he's leading absolute people towards that. And it's very clear who is on which side, based on what you profess to believe. And yet, even Jesus kind of told us this, right? That judge not or you'll be judged, right? And the context of that is not to say that we do not indict wrong when we do see something that is actually flawed or broken, that we do not name it, right? Because we all know that naming something is the first step towards healing, right? Accepting something as it is and not trying to put a delusion or a blindfold over our own eyes. And that is why Jesus also said in that same context in his Sermon on the Mount, which is, for those who do not know, the most famous sermon that he preached, right? So in Matthew 5 to 7, he talked about things like judge not, or you will be judged by the same measure you use to judge others. He also stated that um, remove the speck from your own eye before you can judge, or the plank from your own eye, so that you can sort of see the dirt in your brother's eye. So the point is, what lens are you using to judge and evaluate the world? Um, so the point is not to not assess the world, because the whole idea in that passage is how to assess the world rightly, right? So it's not to assess, but it's to not look at the world in a way that you judge with a measure that you don't actually bring on yourself. It's to be truthful and integrous in the way that you judge. So if you do judge others in a certain standard, then is that standard reflected on back to you? And that brings a lot of questions, right? Because when we put it back on ourselves, we are like, oh, we know our own life, we know why we chose to do certain things, we have certain reasoning. And yeah, so the other person has his own reasoning too. So the idea is the world is more complex than we think. And that is why Jesus' confrontation of the Pharisees in that context was that you judge the world too simplistically, and because you are actually affirming yourself, because you're giving glory to yourself within a small community and community of elites. And so elitism is when you give glory within the echo chamber, and you are indicting the rest of the people whom you deem are different from you, right? Because you would show more grace and compassion towards yourself, because you affirm each other within that circle, and you know each other's in some sense journey or trajectory, or yeah, but you are not listening to the rest of the community, its pains, its struggles, its loads, right? So this, in another verse, Jesus would say, you do not even lift a hand to help those who are carrying a heavy load. In fact, you add more load to them as the religious leaders and leads. Instead of helping and healing, right, you are actually breaking their backs. So the whole idea is that you are listening in on an echo chamber, and you do not actually judge rightly. And that is why the counter argument to that is a good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. So I mean, on a superficial reading, you'll be like, if you're still wearing a certain kind of elitist hat, then it's like, okay, yeah, give me the checklist of the good that people do, and give me a checklist of the bad that people do. So I would immediately be able to recognize and out outcast those who to those who do evil. But that's the entire point the passage is trying to say we should avoid, because it is not that simple. Good and bad, as I think one author brilliantly puts it, right? The line between good and evil goes all the way to each of our human heart. So the idea is the morality is not as simple as we make it out to be. It is actually complex, and it takes lots of insight and observation and time. And at the end, you need to watch the fruits. And for the fruit to grow, it means the seed has to bloom, it has to grow leaves, it has to go all the way to the flower and then the fruit. So the idea is that actually the whole point of it is that there's no checklist, because it's not that simple. It is the intention of the heart. And um, so you watch the symptoms, you watch the signs, and you have to constantly be involved in this ongoing conversation. So the whole point I think that Jesus is driving at in that verse is saying, are we choosing to be part of this deeper conversation about what then is good, what then is flourishing, what then is life-giving to our community, right? Are we still stuck to some ideas of what is life-giving, but perhaps that has become oppressive? Are we continually asking, what is the good? I think that's the point, right? So what is the good? So that we are discerning, and we do not give in to our own elitist voice that tells us that we have already figured it out, nor are we scammed by systems out there. So I think in the Jewish Jesus tradition, it gives us a lot of wisdom, because if you want to think about your beginnings, then the first point I think we must land is it's not that simple. There are no absolutes. So we love absolutes because I think as a species we want to stay as far away from pain. So uncertainty is very painful, because it kind of tells us that tomorrow may bring ill or fortune, right? But we do not want that. We want a hack, right? And that's why the delusion is. But reality is confusion. Reality is confusing. So I think the first step, if we want to look at our beginnings, is to understand that even our stories, where we came from, is fraught with a lot of uncertain symbols, things that even when we look back, we may not know why exactly we do certain things. But the whole idea is, do we own that calling? Right? Do we own that calling? Give me a moment. Let me just reply an urgent text that came in. Yeah. So the whole idea is complex. So I think we must start there. And therefore, we see in the scriptural tradition that there's also a lot of this emphasis on choices and callings, right? Choose you this day whom you shall serve. There was one Joshua, when Moses passed on the leadership to him, he was trying to bring the people to the promised land, and he was like, choose you this day whom you shall serve. So choose life and don't choose death, right? Because yeah, if you live in a certain way, then there's this consequences. If you don't, then that's that, right? And then there are verses that says this is you will hear a voice as you walk. You'll hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. So don't ignore that voice, because that voice is leading you into the ancient path. And this ancient path is a safe path, is a path that brims with insights that in some sense your forebearers have passed on to you, right? So the idea of walking in a certain way. And in the book of Proverbs as well as Hebrews, it says, I think it's Hebrews or one of the letters of Paul, it says, train a child in the way he should go, so that when he grows older, he will not depart from it. So again, there's this idea of the way you should go, right? So there's a lot of emphasis on starting off on the right footing and being very careful about the next step you take. There's a lot of caution involved, right? So again, the psalmist says in Psalms 1 that blessed are those who do not, um, blessed are those, and the idea of being blessed, which means grace, right? The idea that you have been marked out, given a certain ability to rise above temptation, uh, peer pressure, conformity, right? That you are able to walk a certain path that will lead ultimately to your own flourishing. So blessed are those who do not sit with the scornfuls, stand in the way of sinners, right? The idea of not allowing company that perhaps is of a negative influence to actually ruin your character. So that's the kind of watch your trajectory, watch your direction. And then Jesus comes in to say, therefore, look at the outcome of the tree, right? So watch its trajectory. So I think when you hear all of it, do you oftentimes when we think of the scriptures and we think of the religious tradition that of Christianity, we kind of think of there's a God who is very much wanting to police us. So police us meaning that he gives us a lot of rules and checklists and wanting us to immediately conform. If not, we will be on his bad side. So it's like you're here or you're there, us versus them, right? But in fact, when you hear all these things about watching and observing and assessing and evaluating, these are all, in some sense, a narrative of autonomy, right? So it's a narrative of independence where you grow up and you mature and you think deeply, right? So I recently a friend told me that there's a book that actually gave a statistic that actually said that people who don't know come from broken families or underprivileged homes that are there where they don't feel cared for, they actually take a much longer time to mature, or they do not actually grow towards a certain matured developmental stage, right? So there's this idea that in the scriptures we see the opposite. We see that um, there is a possibility that when people feel that they belong, that they have an identity, that they are rooted, that they feel supported um, by the divine, right? They feel supported by, in some sense, what the universe um, brings to them by grace, which is life, which is talents, which is gifts, strength, and they rest in that, and they feel certain that somehow there is a path marked out for them, that even for everyone, but it's for each and every one of you. There's a unique path marked out for us, right? That when we walk this path, we are a blessing towards others and also ourselves. We begin to heal, and we see the world around us begin to heal. Of course, it's a difficult path. It's a path of confronting our demons, going into the dark recesses of our own heart, and also kind of like darkness in the world, right? And facing it. But therein is not holism, right? Therein is a kind of helping us to actually be powerful again, right? Because our power of autonomy is so often being stolen, as we say in the last season, by forces beyond ourselves, right? What culture tells us, what political systems tell us, what our families tell us. So oftentimes we do not have that autonomy to choose. Or in some sense, we choose because we have already been chosen into a certain household or society, right? But suddenly beginning to question, what is your beginning, right? How did this thing happen? How did this mess in your company, in your life, in your relationship happen? Tracing it, not even get, and the point is not about getting some kind of magic bullet, but even thinking about it, is the kind of like the scripture's first step in the antidote to immaturity, the antidote to being controlled by others, you know, the antidote to conforming rather than living your most authentic version of yourself. It is a kind of a first step. So I think today I realize I prepared a lot, but I think I'd just like to land on this. Yeah, that even if you do not agree that you have a soul that will outlast even death, and you know, and all of that, that there's an eternal soul, but I do believe that you do feel that there is something deeper than just eating and sleeping, and you long. Every human being kind of, even if you hate your job, you hate it because you want something more, right? There is some kind of longing for some purpose making between your memories of what has gone on happened, your hopes of what you want in the future. You see, hope and memories are not something that are tangible, right? They are in the past and the future, but why do we feel like these things mean so much to us? Because we are kind of a synergy between our memories, our experiences, our present emotions, beliefs, and values, which is also something that you can't see, but yet it's affecting you, right? These impulses that are causing you to choose certain action, which is like the seed that continues to grow the tree, right? Whatever is in the ultimate fruit has always been in the tree in seed form. So I think the scripture's picture of life calls us to consider, who am I? How have I become this way, right? And to even begin this conversation. And I think that's the idea of God when they talk about God, that he is some sort of the coherent um, meaning maker, which again is not something where he gives you a checklist that as long as you tick all these boxes, you have arrived, right? Which is what the Pharisees kind of like wrongly taught, that the law and all this is just to affirm that I'm part of this elite group and I'm okay, while the rest of the people are not okay, right? So, and I distance myself from the rest of the community rather than empathizing for your neighbor, right? But even God is a symbol of that ongoing conversation that all of us share in our humanity a certain uniform history of both pain and also joy, and possibility for harm and also possibility for growth, right? So today, when you perhaps think about different things that have occurred in your life, right, or even do your own reflection, allow yourself to feel disorientated at times, because that is what it means to be human. To often feels like you're in a vertigo, right? You're not sure um, if whether your next step will lead in the best direction, and you are wrestling with all of that. You're trying to listen to the narratives that around you. You're also trying to listen to what your true, authentic voice is leading you, right? And that's part of it. That's part of it. And I hope that this podcast has, in this first season, God and Beginning, has affirmed you of that we start there. We start not with answers, but with questions.